As I teased the lesson earlier, the title of the lesson is Too Busy Being Fabulous. And it is somewhat a play on an Eagles song that I particularly like and appreciate, but I thought it was kind of a fitting theme to talk about a particular father specifically today, and that would be David. And the text of the message is taken from 2 Samuel chapter 15, starting with verse 30. David walked up the road to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and his feet were bare as a sign of mourning. And the people who were with him covered their heads and wept as they climbed the hill. Contextually, the background or the backstory to this is that David at this point in time probably looks a lot older than his roughly 60 years of age. His shoulders are probably slumped. His head is probably hanging. He shuffles like an old man. And perhaps he's struggling to put one foot in front of the other, partly because he's walking up a fairly steep hill. And the other reason is because he's crying, he's weeping. This is the longest path that probably David has ever had to take. Probably longer than the path that he took from a creek's side to deal with Goliath, the giant. Probably even longer than the winding road that he had to take being a fugitive, being chased down by Saul, to now being a king. This is probably even longer than the really guilty road that David took because of his adulterous affair with Bathsheba, and ended with his confession almost 1 year later. Those trails, obviously, in David's life had some very steep turns, but this one is different because none of them compared with this particular ascent up the Mount of Olives. And as we know from 2 Samuel, he's not wearing a crown any longer. That's because his son, Absalom, has taken it by force. He has no home because the walls that are at his back belong to the city of Jerusalem, the capital that he had established, but now he has to flee because his son has taken over by a coup d'etat. So who wouldn't be crying maybe at a time like this? He has no throne, he has no home, and nothing but the wilderness ahead of him, and for David, a very, very uncertain future. And so we have to ask contextually, well, okay, well, then what happened? I mean, was there some sort of a disease that swept through the city of Jerusalem and they're fleeing the bubonic plague, let's say? Was there some sort of a war that David had engaged in, bet the entire capital city on it and lost? I mean, how does a king like David end up on this really lonely path, walking a very difficult uphill trek? Well, the answer, I think, is if you were to ask David, you would just need to ask his wives and his kids. Because if you were to ask David about his kids, David would probably wince. 14 years now have passed between Bathsheba and 13 years since Nathan told David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10, "The sword, David, will never depart from your house." And now this is all proving painfully, painfully true. Because one of David's sons, his name is Amnon, Amnon fell in lust with his half-sister Tamar. And Amnon craved, he connived, and then he raped her. And then, after Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar, he kicked her to the curb like yesterday's garbage. Understandably, Tamar is beside herself. She's falling apart emotionally, psychologically, physically. She threw ashes on her head and tore this robe of many colors that virgin daughters of the kings would always wear. She's ripping it to shreds. And it says in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 20, that Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house, a different brother. And the next verse gives us David's response to Amnon's brutality. It says, when King David heard all of these things, he was very angry. That's it? Just angry? I mean, we want a much longer verse, I think. We want some verbs, like confront will do, or punish would be nice, or banish would be even better. So we expect to read in this verse, David was very angry, and he confronted Amnon, or he punished Amnon, or he banished Amnon. But what did David do? Nothing. No lecture, no nothing. No imprisonment, no chewing out, and even worse, he did nothing for Tamar. She, of all people, needed her dad's protection, her dad's comfort, her dad coming alongside her. She needed a dad, and David did nothing. All Tamar got was silence. So, Absalom, Tamar's brother, with whom she was staying because of Amnon's rape, he then decides to fill the void created by David's passivity. He sheltered his sister, and then he plotted against his brother Amnon. And then one night, Absalom got Amnon drunk and had him killed. So, now, in just one family, over the course of perhaps several months, we have incest, we have deceit, we have a daughter raped, we have another son murdered, and another child with blood on his hands. David's is a palace that is in absolute turmoil. Again, it was time for David to step up. I mean, be that David that slayed Goliath. Have that courage that you showed when you did that. Or maybe the pardoning mercy that you showed when dealing with Saul. Or maybe that leadership quality that David demonstrated when he had this group of men at this brook called Besor. David's family needed to see the best of David. But they saw none of David. He didn't intervene. He didn't even respond. Instead, David wept in complete solitude. Now, Absalom interpreted David's silence and inaction as anger. Absalom thinks his dad is now angry with him because he has orchestrated the killing of his brother. And so he flees, he leaves. And he goes to another city just outside of Jerusalem and stays with his grandfather. David never, ever, ever made an attempt to see his son. For 3 years, they lived in two separate cities that were essentially next door to one another. Absalom eventually returns to Jerusalem, but David continues to refuse to see his son, even though he's living in the same city. Absalom even married. It says he had 4 children. But it says in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 28, Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. Translation, father and son live in the same community, and for 2 solid years, David never saw his son's face. Frankly, that kind of shunning couldn't have been easy because Jerusalem, at least in that day, wasn't that really big of a town. Avoiding Absalom, I'm thinking, probably included some planning and maybe even David having some spies trying to figure out where Absalom is so that he can avoid where his son is going to be. David succeeded. He succeeded in neglecting his son. And more accurately, he succeeded in neglecting all of his kids. A passage from later in David's life reveals his parenting philosophy. One of his other sons, Adonijah, had staged a military coup. This is different than the Absalom coup. He assembled chariots, he assembled horsemen and personal bodyguards, and it was his intent to take the throne away from his father. And did David object? Are you kidding me? David, it says in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, never crossed him at any time by asking, "Why have you done this?" David is like the Homer Simpson of biblical dads. He is the poster child for passivity. So if you asked David about his kids, he'd likely groan. But if you asked David about his wives, his face would likely turn white as a sheet. Now, we began to suspect a little trouble back in 2 Samuel, starting in the 3rd chapter. What initially at least appears to be kind of a dull genealogy is actually a parade of red flags in David's life. Let me read to you what it says. Sons, plural, were born to David at Hebron. This is before they established Jerusalem as the capital. The first was Amnon, whose mother was Ahinoam from Jezreel. The second son was Chileab, whose mother was Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. The third son was Absalom, whose mother was Maacah, daughter of Talmi, the king of Geshur. The fourth son was Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith. The fifth son was Shephatiah, whose mother was Abital. And the sixth son was Ithream, whose mother was Eglah, David's wife. These were the sons born to David at Hebron. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 2 through 5. Count them. There were 6 different wives, 6 different mothers of his sons. And if you count Michal, who was his first wife given to him by Saul, and Bathsheba, who wasn't in the list, who's probably the most famous wife of all, you have 8 different wives. Too many to even give each one a day a week. But the situation worsens as we uncover this passage that's buried very deeply in David's family Bible. Because after listing the names of his sons, the genealogist in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 9 says, "These were all the sons of David besides the sons of the concubines." Right. The concubines? Yes, his mistresses. This is David's harem side hustle. Porcupines. Probably pretty prickly, this situation he's getting into. So David, we know, fathered other sons through other mothers, and we don't even know how many. And then, what about the girls? I mean, we know about Tamar, but were there other daughters born to him? I would think, at least statistically speaking, probably so. And the cynical side of us wonders if David even knew how many kids he actually had. And when you think about it, David did so much so well. He unified the 12 tribes into one nation. He masterminded enormous military conquests. He founded the capital city of Jerusalem. He elevated God as the Lord of the people, and he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and paved the way for the construction of the temple. He wrote poetry that we still read. He wrote psalms that we still sing. But when it came to his family, David was missing in action. Going AWOL on his family was David's greatest failure. Sure, seducing Bathsheba was inexcusable, and later by David, justified as an act of passion. And then murdering Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, was ruthless, but it was a predictable cover-up of a pregnant wife by a soldier who was on leave. But passive parenting and widespread philandering, these weren't the sins of a night of passion or the panicked response of an unfaithful husband. David's family foul-ups were a lifelong stupor that cost him dearly. And here's why. Do you remember Absalom? David finally reunites with Absalom, but by then it's way too late. For Absalom, the seeds of bitterness have been sown so deeply that he cannot extract that from having any kind of love or affection for his father. And Absalom resolves now to exact some revenge against his dad. And the revenge that he seeks is by a coup d'etat, taking over the city of Jerusalem, taking over David's wives, taking over David's kingdom. So he recruits from within David's own army and stages this coup d'etat. And his takeover set the stage for that sad walk of David out of Jerusalem up the Mount of Olives with which we started this story. No crown, no city, just a heavy-hearted, lonely old man. Now, David had some loyalists who stuck close to him, and they eventually chased Absalom down. And despite strict instructions from David not to do anything to Absalom, when Absalom tries to escape on horseback, as we know, he had some pretty long hair. It gets caught and tangled in the trees. The horse leaves him, and he's dangling. And these loyalists spear Absalom to death. And when David hears the news of his son's death, he falls to pieces. Because in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, he cries out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." A little late for that, don't you think, David? You see, church, David succeeded everywhere except at home. And if you don't succeed at home, do you really succeed at all? How do we explain David's disastrous household? How do we explain David's silence when it comes to his family? No psalms were ever written about his kids. And surely, out of his wives, all of them, he could have written a sonnet or two, don't you think? But he never talked about his family. We know of one prayer that David offered, and that was the prayer for the baby to survive as a result of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. That is the only prayer in which we have recorded that David has talked about somebody other than him praying to God. Scripture gives us no indication that David ever prayed for his family. He prayed for his enemies, the Philistines. We have record of that. He interceded for his employees, his soldiers. We have record of that. He offered prayers for a really close friend. His name was Jonathan. We read about that too. And frankly, he could even pray for his former arch-rival, Saul. But as far as his family was concerned, it's as if they didn't exist. prayers for his family were either unimportant or perhaps simply unrecorded. Was David just too busy to notice them? Maybe. He had a city to settle, right? He had a kingdom to build. Was he just too important to care for them? I mean, maybe he's thinking, hey, I'm going to let the wives raise the kids and I will lead the nation. Maybe that's what he was rationalizing. Was he maybe too guilty to parent them? I mean, after all, how could David, who had seduced Bathsheba and then intoxicated and murdered her husband to cover up the affair, how is he going to correct his sons when they are raping and murdering themselves? Maybe he's just too busy. Maybe just too important. Maybe too guilty. And that's where it reminds me of the song by the Eagles, Too Busy Being Fabulous. The last verse of that song says, you were too busy being fabulous, too busy to think about us, to drink the wine from your winner's cup, to notice the children were growing up, and you were just too busy being fabulous. And David, too busy, too fabulous, too guilty, too late. At this point in time, David is a dozen exits too late. But for you dads, this one included, it's not too late for us. Your home should be your giant-sized privilege. And you should make your family a towering priority. Don't make David's tragic mistake. He collected wives like he collected trophies. He saw spouses as a means to his pleasure, not really ever as a part of God's plan. So men, don't make David's mistake. Be fiercely loyal to your spouse. You've made a promise to her, so keep it. And as you do, nourish and encourage and parent the children that God has given you both. The real news, unlike fake news, you hear that expression a lot, the real news is that there are quiet heroes that dot the landscape of our society every day. They don't wear ribbons. They don't kiss winners' cups. They wear spit up. They kiss owies instead. They don't make the headlines, but they do check their children's outlines. And they also stand and cheer for their kids on the sidelines too. You won't find their names on the Nobel Peace Prize short list, but you'll find their names on the list for the PTA or the carpool. News programs don't call them, but that's okay because their kids do. They call him Dad. And men, be numbered among those heroes. Your children are not your hobby. They are your calling. Your spouse is not your trophy. She is your treasure. Don't pay the price that David paid, because if you flip ahead just a few chapters to his final hours, you'll see the ultimate cost that David paid for neglecting his family. David is now just a few hours from death. And a chill has kind of set into his body as his body is winding down, that blankets just can't keep warm. So David's servants decide that David needs a person to snuggle with him, someone to hold him tight as David is drawing his last breath. But do they turn to one of the wives? I mean, he had at least 8 of them, we know. No, the servants didn't turn to the wives. Okay, well, maybe the servants turned to some of the kids, right? Because For all we know, he had hundreds of them. Did the servants turn to any of the kids? No. The servants instead, and I'm reading from 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. The servants looked in every corner of Israel until they found Abishag from Shunem. They brought her to the king. She was very beautiful. She cared for the king and served him. But the king didn't have sex with her. Oh, that's nice. She's just a really pretty heatolator. Sadly, I suspect that David would have traded all of his conquered crowns for the tender arms of a wife, maybe even a child. But it was way too late. Hundreds of exits now, too late. David died in the care of a complete stranger because he'd made complete strangers out of his family. It's not too late for us, dads. Make your wife the object of your devotion. Make her the recipient of your deepest passion. Love the one who wears your ring, and cherish the children who share your name. Succeed at home first. Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verse 34, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Otherwise, you'll end up being too fabulous for anyone to really care. You know, dads, it only takes a moment to make a child. But it takes a lifetime to love and to nurture one. So love your kids. Love them like God loves you. God would do anything for you. And he proved it by sending his son to die for your sins and for mine. And although you can't sacrifice for your child's sins, you can't even sacrifice your own, you can model that sacrifice by being present in your child's life since it started kind of with you. And like Christ, he died to have a relationship with you. Not for a religion called by his name that he just chose to no longer be involved in. The message that I get from David is that we have a day like a Sunday, once every year in June, and it's called Father's Day. And it's called Father's Day for a reason. So dads, today, and today going forward, the challenge is be one. Be involved in your family. Be involved in their life. Do everything you can to love your children, to care for them, to guide them, to nurture them, to raise them, to train them, to be involved in their life. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot like David for you, in which you end up being ministered to perhaps by total strangers because you've made complete strangers out of your family. Don't let that happen. Be a dad. Be involved. Be engaged. And love your kids. So happy Father's Day. So we've picked this next song, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. Again, I told you it's always a little challenging sometimes to pick songs that are thematic, especially for Father's Day. But since we're talking about love, which was the song before the message, since we were talking about love, which was the message, then blessed be the tie that binds. It brings our hearts in Christian love to celebrate and joyfully accept and love each other. If you have any prayer requests, you can hand them up as we sing this song. At the close of the song, we'll talk about those prayer requests and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing, please.